We are in the tail end of our study of chapter 10, which is the story of the southern, what is known as the Southern Campaign. And we're gonna share my screen. So there was some technical glitch over the last couple of weeks where there was a video missing. So if anybody encountered that problem, that's been fixed. So the first shear on this chapter has now been posted and the numbers have been updated. And so there are 2 shiurim so far posted on chapter 10. And today, hopefully, will be the third and final study of this unit. And then we'll move on to the next. So let's go into shared screen. Okay, and if you can keep your videos on, that's helpful to me. If not, that's okay. So we had looked at this chapter over the last couple of weeks from just the perspective of what happened. The campaign, the armies of the south, Yerushalayim and its allies came to attack Givon, the 5 Canaanite kings against the 4 cities of Givon. We compared it to the story of the 4 kings against the 5 kings in the battle of Kedar Omer and Melech Sdom by Abraham. That was last week's year. And essentially, Yehoshua, like Abraham, manages in this campaign to really take control of the central core in the entire south, and really the central core of the land of Israel from Gilgal through Yerushalayim and then down south all the way to the Negev and the Sinai. And so, for all intents and purposes, from a military perspective, he has that's the major conquest at this time. There's one more piece of it, which is chapter 11, where he does a similar type of thing in the north, and at that point really has essentially established control over the entire mountain range of the land of Israel. And we'll talk about settlement and living in the land and the tribes going into their territory at a later time in the book. But for now, we're still at this point of this conquest. And the one piece of the story that we haven't addressed, if you remember, I'm just going to show you quickly the map. This is the map. So Yerushalayim and Yarmut and Hebron, Eglon, they come to attack Givon. Yehoshua is asked by Givon to defend. So he comes, he takes his army in the middle of the night through the mountain, through the hills, comes to Givon and launches a surprise counteroffensive and pushes the armies of Yerushalayim and its allies through Murad Bet Haron, Ayalon, Emek Ayalon, and down towards the south. And then he lays chase. He chases the armies Makedah, where the 5 kings hide, and he continues to chase the armies Livna, Yarmut, Lachish, Eglon, and then he heads east towards Hebron, then south to Devir, all the way to Eretz Goshen. The major campaign, he moves his armies, and one of the things he tells the soldiers in the army of Israel is not to waste, not to rest, not to stop, because he wants to make sure that he is able to really just sort of address the armies and vanquish these armies before they have a chance to return to their cities and to fortify themselves. And so he says in Pasuk Chet, in Pasuk and Yutet, after there's this the kings are hiding, he says, don't worry about the kings for now. Atem al ta'modu litfuach vechem bezinavtem otam. Go and run after the enemy and capture them or smite them from the rear, meaning as they are running. Al titnum lavo el arehem. Don't let them return to their cities. And that's the key piece. We've talked about this a number of times. On the one hand, he's now divided the kings. They're all on the run. And at the same time, more importantly for him, strategically and tactically, he needs to take these armies out while they are in the open field, not let them get back into the safety of the walled, fortified cities. And so he runs this chase all through the south to come back to the 5 kings afterwards. And so literally city by city, he goes from he goes through Makedah, and then he goes to Livna and Lachish, and then to Hebron, and again, and Eglon, Hebron, and eventually Devere, and so on and so forth. Okay. The one piece that we have left for this week, which I want to address today, is probably the most famous and most complex piece of this chapter. And that is these 2 or 3 psukim at the beginning, which I did not examine in depth. But let's go back now. We'll start with Pasuk Yud. As the battle unfolds, Vayihumem Hashem lifnei Yisrael, God confounds the armies before Israel. Vayakem makah gdola b'Givon, there was a great victory in Givon. Vayirdefem, and Yehoshua chases after them. Derech Maleh Bet Choron, via this Maleh Bet Choron, as we've talked about. Vayakem ad Azekah ve'ad Makedah, and he begins to chase them down towards Azekah and towards Makedah, and so on and so forth. This is this part of this campaign right here that we're talking about in Emek Ayalon. Vayi binusam mipnei Israel, as they are chasing after, as Bnei Israel are chasing them, and they're running. Hein b'marad bet Choron v'Hashem yishlich alehem avanim gdolot min hashamayim. God brought down upon them great stones from heaven. What are great stones from heaven? It could be an avalanche. It was a very steep valley or hill that they were climbing down, Marad Bet Choron. So it's possible that this pass was so steep that there was an avalanche, or it's possible that the skies opened up and there was a hailstorm that, as it's described here, Avnei Barad. וימותו רבים אשר מתו באבני ברד, וימותו רבים אשר מתו באבני ברד מאשר חרגו בני ישראל בחרב. And these Avnei Barad, these hailstones, killed more, destroyed more of the enemy than even the swords of Yehoshua, the great miracle, and literally the hailstones, skies opened up, and the clouds came, skies opened up, and Barad came down. Let's work it that way. Az yidaber Yehoshua laHashem. Then Yehoshua spoke to God, or said to God, and this phrase, Az Yedaber, already denotes some kind of shira, some kind of song, some kind of poetic description, like Az Yashir Moshe, it's the same kind of grammatical form. Az instead of the Vav Ha'ipuch, the reversal Vav, Az Yedaber Yehoshua, B'yom tet Hashem et Amori lifnei b'nei Israel, the day that God delivered the Amorites to Israel. Vayomer le'nei Yisrael, and he said in the eyes of Israel, meaning in the presence, he said publicly, Shemesh b'givon dom, v'yareach v'emek ayalon. One of the most famous phrases in Tanakh. Sun, stand still in Givon, and the moon in the valley of Ayalon. Vayidom HaShemesh, and the sun stood still. V'yareach hamad, and the moon stayed. Ad yikom goy oivav, until the nation avenged their enemies.
Doesn't the word dom mean be silent?
It can. Amod dom in modern Hebrew means to stand at attention. But in this case, it comes to the word vaya amod, to vayidom hashemesh ve'erech amad, right? Silence meaning it stopped. Stand still. Don't move. ויעמוד השמש בחצי השמיים ולאץ לבוא כיום תמים. So I skipped a phrase. וידום השמש וירח עמד עד יקום אויביו. The sun stood and the moon stayed until the nation destroyed its enemies. הלא כתובה על ספר הישר. This is written in the book of the just, the book of the righteous, whatever Sefer Yashar means. ויעמוד השמש בחצי השמיים. The sun stood in the midst of the heaven. V'lo atz lavo kiyom tamim. And it did not come down, or it didn't run to hasten to come down to set as kiyom tamim, about a whole day. It's translated here. We'll see what that means. ולא היה קיים ההוא לפניו ואחריו לשמוע השם בכל איש, כי השם נלחם לישראל. There was no day like it before or after that God heeded the voice of man and God fought for Israel. And then the story continues, Vayashav Yehoshua b'chol Yisrael amo el machane Gilgala, which is the summary of the entire battle at the end of the day. We talked about that verse in the middle at a previous year. This is really the core of the piece, of the discussion. What is this miracle of the sun, as it's described, the sun standing still? So let's take a step back for a second and analyze the whole story from the perspective of the following question. Was Yeshua's victory against the kings of Yerushalayim and his allies a victory that we would describe as a natural miracle or a supernatural miracle? Right? You understand, a hidden miracle, overt miracle. Today we have lots of miracles going on in Israel. Israel's victories against enemies are extraordinary. We would call them natural miracles, miracles hidden in the context and the hand of God operating within the hidden veil of nature. Is this miracle of Yeshua's victory against the armies of Yerushalayim, was that a natural miracle, military, like David HaMelech? Right? In the time of David HaMelech, as an example, Shirat David is a classic example. David has many victories against his enemies. He fights extraordinary battles, and he has extraordinary moments. Shirat David is a beautiful ode, a beautiful tribute to God and to God's role in David's victories. At no point in David's life, at any battle that David fought, was there ever a miracle that changed the course of nature. Fact. But David attributed all those miracles to God because that's what you do, right? That's what we say Hallel for. So was Yeshua's victory here natural or supernatural? That's the question. There are elements that point to both. On the one hand, Yehoshua has to fight, has to bring his army. He has to bring his army up against the armies of Yerushalayim and defend Givon by moving them suddenly all night long under the cover of nighttime. Kol halayla. Right? That's a military tactic. Or the use of the element of surprise, or the way in which he hides the kings. He leaves the kings of Canaan to go and fight the enemy and chase them, and to make sure he chases them all quickly, all through the day and the next day, and not let them return to the fortifications of the cities because he's afraid of the walls of the city. He doesn't want to let the enemy gain the upper hand. It's a classic military tactic. If we were talking about the kind of victory in the terms of, for example, the way Yehoshua conquered Jericho, he wasn't afraid, he wasn't worried about the walls. The walls posed no problem in the Battle of Jericho because the Malach came and they blew the shofar and the walls came down. So if it's a supernatural miracle, you blow the shofar, the walls come down. If it's a natural miracle, you chase your enemy in open territory and hopefully you're victorious. And he warns the army, don't stop, don't let the army come back to their base. All of those indications are that this was a natural miracle. On the other hand, there are elements here that are clearly hand of God in a very open way. For example, this phrase, Pasuk Yud, just before the Shirat Yehoshua, if you will, if you want to call it that. Vayihumem Hashem lifnei Yisrael, God confounded them. Vayakem makah gdola beGivon, God smote a great smite against them in Givon. Vayirdefem derech maleh betchoron, as they are running, as Yeshua is chasing them, that's the hand of God. God took more soldiers out through the hail that suddenly appeared than they were able to do in their by the chase of the army. That's an engagement of God's hand in this. It almost sounds like, it reads like, very similar to another great victory that the army of Israel was assisted from the heavens, if you will, namely the story of Devorah and the battle against and Barak and the battle against Sisera, where in the middle of the Nachal, they're in the midst of this valley that's where the chariots of Sisera are camped, and suddenly Nachal Kishon Grafam. Suddenly there's a flash flood, and the entire valley is filled with water, and a flash flood like we've seen, and it destroyed the army of Sisera. And on top of that, if you go to Shoftim Perek Hey and Shira Tavor, where she describes Nachal Kishon Grafam, Nachal Kishon, the river of Kishon swept them away. Go back one verse, Min Hashemayim Nilchamu. God fought for us from the skies. Hakochavim mimesilotam nilchamu Sisra. The stars fought against Sisra. The stars fight against Sisra. So some of the Mepharshim say, if you want to confuse a horse, there's several ways, right? The chariots are run by horses. If you want to confuse a horse, there are several things that are very powerful that can confuse a horse. And one of them is these sort of meteor showers or shooting stars in the midst of the middle of the battle. Now, there's stars floating around. The stars in their courses confused the horses of Sisera and caught them unprepared in the valley in the Nachal, as the Nachal over river, ancient river, meaning a dry bed river, a valley, and suddenly it became filled with water from a flash flood, and before you knew it, az halmu ikvesus midaharot darot abirav. The horse hoofs stamped and they were prancing and the horses were confused and the victory was won. So you have moments, even in the midst of natural battles, where God's hand is clear, is evident, as is the case in the Avnei Barad, in the hailstones that came down from heaven in the midst. The language here is very reminiscent of the battles, for example, of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of the Makot Mitzrayim. Shirat and Kriyat Yamsuf, Makat Barad, Makat Choshech, Makat Arbe. There's many of the phrases here that are reminiscent of the entire experience of Yetziat Mitzrayim and the Makot Mitzrayim. I gave you a chart in the source page, which again I'm going to make sure you all have. Anybody came in now? In the source page, I sort of gave you a little chart of the language that appears in the story of Yeshua's southern campaign. Vayuhumem, confounded them, a phrase that appears in Shirat Devorah as well. Certainly, Makot Mitzrayim, but the chariots of Paro go into Yamsuf, Vayahom et Machane Mitzrayim, confounded them. You have the notion of Barad. God sent Barad. Barad is certainly one of the Makot of Mitzrayim. But you also have this notion that this story, this battle, we'll come to the sun standing still in a moment, that this day was unique in its history, in its annals, in its context, whatever the issue of the sun is. This was unique because God was fighting for Israel. Ki Hashem nilcham Yisrael. That phrase also appears. It appears by Barad, for example, Bahi Barad Kaved Ma'od Asher Lo Haya Kamo B'chol Eretz Mitzrayim. There was none like it in the history of Egypt, which reflects the notion that this wasn't an ordinary hail; it was a supernatural moment. Or the Arbe, where it says about the Arbe Lefanav Lo Hayachen Arbe Kamo V'Acharav Lo Yeke, nothing like it ever was or will be. Or even the phrase "Ki Hashem nilcham lahem" was what Mitzrayim said about God in Egypt. Mitzrayim amusa mipnei Yisrael, ki Hashem nilcham lahem b'Mitzrayim. God is fighting for them. The language Az Yedaber Yehoshua, which is certainly Shira-like language, Az Yashir Moshe, even the grammar is similar. And then there's one more phrase which we kind of referenced in passing, which is when it talks about the enemies of Israel not being able to be victorious against the army of Yehoshua, Lo charatz livnei Yisrael leish et leshono. No enemy of Israel was able to wet their tongue. Does that mean, or to bark, if you will? That is a phrase that appears only one other place, which is by Makat Bechorot, L'chol b'nei Yisrael lo yecharatz kelev leshono. So the language is links us so clearly to the story of Makot Mitzrayim, which was Again, a supernatural miracle. In that sense, by the way, there is a simple way to explain this notion of the sun and the moon. Okay, we're going to get to the issue of the miracle, the nature of this miracle in a second. But before we even get to the broader question, philosophical questions, the notion that somehow Yehoshua asked for additional light, maybe even as it was dark for the enemy, possibly, may be also reminiscent of Makot Mitzrayim. Because by Makot Choshech, it says that Lo ra'a ish et achiv, that no man could see another in the plague of darkness. U'lecho b'nei Yisrael haya or b'moshvatam, but there was light for Israel. So the notion that we had light while our enemies had darkness is a paradigm that also comes from the plagues of Egypt, or Kriyat Yamsuf, where it says Vayhi ha'anan v'achoshech v'yaret halayla, where there was a cloud that made darkness for the Egyptians and a fire and a pillar of fire that gave light to Israel. Rashi says there, "Vayanan v'achoshech leMitzrayim, v'yair amud ha'esh et halayla Yisrael." The choshech was created by the cloud for Egypt, so that they couldn't see, and the fire created light for Israel as they went through the Yamsuf. So the notion that we had light while the enemy had darkness is another theme that connects to Makot Mitzrayim. So you have Barad, and you have the notion of a unique moment that's unparalleled in history, like Arba and Choshech. You have darkness for our enemy and light for Israel. And you have Makat Bechot Lo Yefratz Kelev L'Shono, and you have Ma'yahom and Kriyat Yamsuf, and you have the Shira. You have all these pieces of Makot Mitzrayim, with one profound difference. In Makot Mitzrayim, you have to remember that the plagues of Egypt, the goal there, the plagues, the miracle of the plagues, was the goal unto themselves. That was the purpose, was the plagues themselves, because it was Laman Rabot Muftai Be'eretz Mitzrayim. It was the purpose was for the Egyptians and for the Israelites to learn the power of God and to see the hand of God's miracles. It was the end unto itself, not a means to an end. Whereas here, whatever miracle this sun standing still is a miracle that is to enable backup, if you will, like the Barad, which is backup to the power of Israel, right, back up to Yehoshua's forces. So there's a profound difference between, even if the miracles are of a similar magnitude, which we're going to discuss, there's a profound difference. There, the miracles were the goal, and here, they're simply backup to Yehoshua to enable Yehoshua's victory. Unlike, for example, Yericho, when the angel came to Yehoshua and said, "This battle's mine, I will bring the walls down," and that's why Yehoshua made a cherem on Yericho. Here he doesn't make such a cherem, and here seems to be Yehoshua's battle. And yet we have this extraordinary miracle, which, if I take literally, is probably the greatest miracle in the history in all of Tanakh. From a perspective of the impact it has in the natural order of things, this miracle is truly unparalleled in the scope of what it would do to the universe, to the cosmos, to stop the sun in its tracks. Just think about the solar system, what that would mean. And so the question becomes, is this really literally to be taken at face value as one of the, as it's described, that the sun stood still in the middle of the sky, and that's what is described here in Pasuk Yudalid as unprecedented. That God would listen to a man and fight their battles by stopping the sun in its tracks. This question is explored by the Rishonim, it's explored in the Medrash, it's explored by the Mefarshim, philosophers, from one end of the spectrum to the other. And so I want to walk you through, very briefly, a kind of a bird's eye view of all of the different opinions, from one end of the spectrum to the other. And then hopefully we will, I'll share with you my intuitive sense, although I think you can already see where it's going to go. So let's go back to the source page for a moment. Everybody have the source page? Very briefly, there's a series of midrashim that appear in the Gemara, in the Medrash Pikari of Eliezer, in Medrash Rabbah. So it's a certain approach amongst Chazal, certainly, to see this miracle in very literal terms. In fact, the Gemara in Avodah Zarah asks the question, what does it mean when the verse says that the sun did not set, lo atzlavo, ki yom tamim, like a full day? What does it mean? How long? Rabbi Shulman Levi says it was 24 hours. What does 24 hours mean? Azoshit, kamshit, azoshit, kamshit. It moved, it rose for 6 hours, then it stayed in the middle of the sky for 6 hours, then it set for another 6 hours, then it stayed just before sunset for another 6 hours. Kula miltuk yom tamim, a full 24-hour period in the course of 12 hours. That's how Rabbi Shulman Levi understood it. Rabbi Elazar understands it as 36 hours, meaning ki yom tamim is reflecting on how long the sun stood. In the course of a 12-hour day, an additional yom tamim, an additional 24 hours existed in that sequence, and therefore it was 36 hours. Rabbi Shmuel ben Nachmani says it was 48 hours. Right? Again, arguing the technicality in the Medrash about how long the sun stood still, but it's a foregone conclusion that they all perceived this to be a very literal moment in Yeshua's description. It also tells me why the sun stood still. In each of these cases, Yeshua, this was a very military perspective, aid to Yehoshua, meaning that Yehoshua is fighting the battle against the Canaanites, and he needed extra time in order to do so. And so the sun stood still for that reason. Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer takes a different approach, that it was Friday, Hamofet Shishi, and because it was Friday, Yehoshua was fighting the Canaanites. Ad Sheba Yehoshua Basan Milchamtan Yisrael. V'giya le'erev Shabbat. He gets to erev Shabbos. V'ra'ah b'tzaratan Yisrael shelo yichalelu Shabbat. And he saw that the plight of Israel, he didn't want them fighting on Shabbos, so he stopped the sun so they could finish the battle before Shabbos began. Which again puts it into somewhat of a religious perspective, but at the end, all of these Mefarshim, opinions in Chazal certainly look at the story from the perspective of a literal sun standing still in the middle of the sky. In Medrash, Rabbi raises the question, compares it to the splitting of the sea and the fire that protected, and Hanan Mishov Azariah that was saved from the fiery furnace of Nebuchadnezzar, or Daniel that was saved from the lion's den by a malach that came and protected him. Similarly, you have the Shemesh v'Yareach, She'amdu lifnei Yehoshua, that all of these, the sun and the moon that stood for Yehoshua, all of these miracles, which are truly miracles of a supernatural nature, were all kind of created by God at the moment of creation. So there's certainly that perspective, that this is exactly as it's described. So, second, I'm just gonna, that this is exactly as, oops, where did I go? There we go. As it's described, an extraordinary, unprecedented, and unparalleled miracle. And we could live with that. We could live with Kriyat Yamsuf. We could live with many miracles. I could live with Yeshua's great miracle of the sun standing still. But the Mefarshim ask two profound questions. One is, if I compare this verse, that this is unparalleled, a miracle of a nature that is unreckoned with. God should listen to man's voice to say, stop the sun in its tracks. Compare that with the last verse of Chumash. The last verse of Chumash, it says that Moshe Rabbeinu was the greatest prophet ever to arise, not only in terms of his power of prophecy, speaking to God face to face, but also because of all the wonders and miracles that God sent him to do in Egypt for Paro and his servants, and the great outstretched arm, and all of the great miracles and wonders, which Moshe did before all of Israel. In other words, the verse says that Moshe was unparalleled not just in his power of prophecy, but in the nature of the miracles he performed. before Egypt and before Israel. So the Mefarshim, and all of them raise this question. They have different approaches to how to answer it, but the most articulate formulation of the question is in the Rabbi, and so that's where we're really going to start. The Rabbi addresses this issue head on, the miracle of the sun standing still. And he says, "Bezot parsha yesh svakot rabot." Now, it's a very long Rabbi, so I shortened pieces of it to kind of encapsulate the core of the question. He says there are a lot of questions here. First, im haya she'ashemesh amad ubatel mi'atnu'ah hani'et lo, if in fact the sun stood still and did not continue in its orbit, or our orbit around the sun, right? If the cosmos stood still, forgetting for a moment what would happen to the laws of nature, הנה היה זה המופת יותר נפלא לאין שיעור מהמופתים שנעשו על ידי משה. That would be a miracle in its power, in its global reach and universal reach, greater than any miracle Moshe performed. ואם היה עניין כן, and if that's true, הנה זה סותר מה שאמרה תורה שלו קם נביא עוד בישראל כמשה. Then that would contradict what the Torah says about Moshe being unparalleled. And so both those questions, the nature of a miracle of extraordinary nature, unprecedented, and the fact that it contradicts what seems to be the status of Moshe as the greatest Navi of our people, this is problematic. And so, taking that from the perspective of the Mefarshim now, our journey takes us into, leaving Chazal aside for a moment, how Chazal deal with it is midrashic. I'm going to leave for a second. The Mefarshim divide into three basic schools, and you can already imagine, right, from one end of the spectrum to the other. Those who maximize the miracle, those who kind of contextualize it, limit it, and those who see it else in some other fashion altogether. So school number one are those who take this story quite literally, exactly as Chazal see it in the Gemara, that the sun stood still in the middle of the sky. Deal with the cosmos how you want to deal with it. Abarbanel, Vayidom Hashemesh, Zachar Shakel Yitbarach Asa Shelato Vakashato. God did exactly what Yehoshua asked of him. Vayidom Hashemesh Amad Mitnuah Hayoredet. The sun stood in the sky, it didn't continue to set, and at the same time, remember the sun and the moon are at opposite ends of the sky, and so if the sun stops, the moon stops, says the Abarbanel. Theoretically, it's possible for that not to be the case, but in this case, that's how he understood it. To me, and that continued until the victory was won ad Yukom Go'evav. Similarly, the Radak says, Zot HaPliya, this wonder, Ktuva al Sefer HaYashar. What is the Sefer HaYashar? It's also a question. We're not going to address at length, but what is this book of the just? Says the Radak, that is the Torah. Who's Sefer Torah Moshe? Where is the miracle of Yehoshua alluded to in the Torah? So Radak says, if you go back to Chet HaEgel and the aftermath of Chet HaEgel and the brit that God made with Moshe and Bnei Yisrael, it says, Neged kolamcha esen niflaot, I will perform wonders before you and before all of the nations of the world. And the nations will be shocked by it. Kishte otot amala b'pasuk hazeh. He alludes to in this pasuk two great wonders. Number one, Krinat Pnei Moshe, the greatness, the shining of Moshe's light from his face, as it says, Ki norahu asher ani oseh imach. Awesome, that which I do with you. And the second, Amidat Hashemesh liYehoshua, the sun standing still for Yehoshua. As it says, Neged kol amcha seniflot. I will do wonders that have never been created before. He gave him a sign in the short term, meaning Moshe, that they could see in order to give them the trust for the miracle that would be performed in the future. Very literal reading of the story. But again, it doesn't address these two questions. They seem to, for now, leave these questions aside. What do I do with the pasuk about Moshe? What do I do with the nature of this miracle? So the second school of thought really starts from the Rambam and in the world of the Mefarshim who try to analyze what the Rambam means. Okay, so there's two pieces to this. There's the language of the Rambam in the Guide to the Perplexed, which addresses this question. And then there is the analysis of the Rambam's language, which appears in the Mefarshim on the Moreh Nevuchah. And the Rambam asks exactly this question. He talks about Moshe's unique status, and he's talking about the power of Moshe's prophecy and the power of his miracles. And he says, even with regards to the miracles that Moshe performed, אמנם ההבדל מופתב על הכלל ממופתי כל נביא על הכלל. Generally, Moshe's miracles are also in a different category than the miracles of other prophets. כל הנפלאות אשר עשו הנביאים, all miracles performed by other prophets or done by them, הגידו בהם יחידים מבני אדם כאותות אליהו ואלישע. They're essentially performed by in the context of an individual or a small number of people. Eliyahu, who brings back to life the child of the Ben Sofit Talmana, or Elisha brings back the child of the Shashunamite. These were miracles that were performed, unbelievable, amazing, but they were done inside. They were done in a house. They were done privately. They were done for one individual. Even Eliyahu and Har Carmel is for a small group of people. No prophet ever performed, says the Rambam, a miracle in the presence of the entirety of the Jewish people. Hold the question. I already can hear it, right? Let's see, and he'll address it in a second. And that's true with the miracles of every prophet other than Moshe Rabbeinu. The miracles of Moshe Rabbeinu have three characteristics that are unique. They are public, b'farhesya. They are le'enei ha'ohev v'hasoneh. They are in the eyes, in the presence of both the Jewish people and our enemies. Hano'ot lo v'hacholek alav. That is similar to that's what Moshe Rabbeinu did, and that's what the pasuk says. If you go back to the pasuk for a moment, you'll see it references these great miracles and signs that Moshe did be'eretz Mitzrayim leFaro, in Egypt for Paro, and le'enei kol Yisrael, in the presence of all of Israel. So that's the unique status of Moshe's miracles. They're public for all of Israel and for the enemies at the same time. Kriyat Yamsuf, as an example. Raised a question. There are obvious questions to ask about Yehoshua. We'll come to them in a second. Says the Rambam, V'lo yita'acha, don't make the mistake of thinking, Mashaba me'amidat or hashemesh liYehoshua. Yehoshua made the sun stand still. That's very public. All those hours are shortay. And it says that it was done le'enei Yisrael, in the eyes of Israel. And that was certainly for our enemies too. Says the Rambam, Ki lo yomar le'enei kol Yisrael k'Moshe ba b'Moshe. Only a subset of Israel saw this, meaning the part of Israel that was fighting in the battle. The rest of Israel didn't see it. So it's a subset of the people of Israel, not all of Israel. You can already hear the question, which is, if only the people on the battlefield saw the miracle, if the miracle was stopping the sun in the sky, that's not only global, that's cosmological. So you can't say that this was a local miracle for only the soldiers on the battlefield if you're talking about literally the sun standing still in the middle of the sky. You hear the argument. What we do with it, how we understand it, we'll see in a second. Secondly, in addition, when I said that this was a matter of hours and not days, what does Kiyom Tamim mean? It means that the day was elongated to the length of the longest day of the year. What's the longest day of the year? Sometime in July, right? So if it was in the springtime It was a little bit, few hours longer. Ki tamim means shalem, whole. Ki ilama sheyomahu haya etzlam begivon ki gadol shebimei hakayitz. That day in Givon was like the longest day of the summer. I don't know when the battle took place. Whenever it took place in hail doesn't usually come in Israel in the middle of the summer, in the middle of July. That was you had both hail and you had the longest day of the year. But what do I do with the fact that how does he understand the fact that only the people on the battlefield saw this miracle and not the people in the and not the rest of the world? So there are a number of different approaches to the Rambam, and I'm just giving you a cross sections. You can research it. That's an extraordinary story. Here's the Abarbanel's interpretation of the Rambam, and I think it makes a great deal of sense. It fits into the pattern that we've identified before. Says the Abarbanel, and I apologize, I don't have these sources in English, couldn't find translation, so I'm just going to translate on the fly. This question related to the nature of this miracle, the global, universal nature of this miracle, says the Abarbanel in his understanding of the Rambam, this miracle, according to the Rambam, was not the stopping of the sun literally in the sky. He didn't freeze the cosmos, but rather, sham or the fact that there was the creation of light. Enough light, God invented night vision. He gave Israel night vision. The Canaanites had darkness, and Yehoshua had night vision, so that they could conduct themselves in the battle in the middle of the night. And he says that's why the Rambam writes, Sheba me'amidat or Hashemesh. It doesn't say the sun stood. He says the light of the sun stood. I mean, that or Hashemesh liYehoshua. This nes, which was miraculous, ki nes shechidesh HaKadosh Baruch Hu, shezeh or mechudash, aspik aleim, right? This was a new light. This was created light for them. Where else have we had God's miracles universal? Not that the whole world was, the nature of the universe was changed, but a local miracle that enabled light to serve as a role in the miracle. It's exactly what you had in Mitzrayim. It's exactly the same as the story of Choshech Mitzrayim. They had darkness, we had light. Doesn't mean that the sun stood in its tracks, but rather there was light that was created, night vision. That's a very, very different kind of miracle. Miraculous it is, but it places the story in the context of the miracles of Mitzrayim, which, if you think about the language being used, we started the shir today, this afternoon, this evening, and what time zone you're in, we started earlier by comparing the story, the language, to the Makot Mitzrayim. We had Barad, we had Arba, we had Makat B'cholot, now we have Choshech. Says the Abarbanel, that's exactly what the Rambam means. That we didn't stop the sun in its orbit, we provided light for the soldiers on the battle. Okay, Makat Choshech. That I can live with. Much more comfortable with that context here. And there's a reason why I'm uncomfortable with, if you haven't figured it out already, why I'm uncomfortable with the literal reading of the sun standing still in its cosmological order. That's the second approach. There is a third approach. And the third approach is articulated by the Rabbi and many contemporary scholars, both within the world of the Beit Midrash as well as in the world of biblical scholarship. This third approach is more controversial on the one hand. On the other hand, I actually think it fits the pshat of the perek in context much more holistically. And I want to explain that. This third approach is reflected in the Rabbi, who asked the question. I quoted him at the beginning of our study, who asked the question. And he writes the following. Mamar Yehoshua haya, when Yehoshua said, Shemesh begivon dom, sun stands still, ad yikom goyot oivav, until a nation vanquishes its enemy. What was he asking for? Mamar Yehoshua haya, sheterem shiyasur hashemesh miyot al givon v'hayarech miyot al emek ayalon, tishlam nikmat goy oivav. He wasn't asking for the sun to stand still. He was asking for the battle to be faster, for the battle to be completed before the sun set. That's what he was asking. Aval katsar katuv bazeh. The language of the text is encapsulates it and it summarizes it. If you want to understand where this comes from, go back to the original text. The original text said, there's a version of it here. It said, Shemesh begivon vayidom Shemesh, the sun stood, v'yarech hamad, the moon stood, ad yikom goy oivav, until the nation finished and vanquished its enemies. That's the issue. Haratzon b'zeh shekvar dimem Shemesh begivon v'yarech ba'emek ayalon, ad shenishlema zot ha'melacha me'anakama. In other words, they were able to finish this battle in a sense as if they felt it was a long day, but it was a long day in which they managed to accomplish more than one day's worth of victory. Which was miraculous. It wasn't enough that Israel should be victorious over their enemies, but that this victory should be in a short period of time. That we should be able to accomplish in that one day what it would take a normal army under normal circumstances weeks and months to accomplish. And you go back to that map and look at the distance they have to run. Look at the distance they have to chase their enemies. Even forget the rest of this. This is all in the next day. Even just from Givon down through Beit Horon, down to Emek Ayalon, down to chase these enemies, that's more than a day's worth of battle. And yet to do all of that in one day, to the point of the 5 kings are hiding in their cave while Yehoshua continues the battle down south, that, says the Rabbi, is Shemesh Begivon dom. Now go to the next verse. There has not been any day like it since. Lishmoa Hashem b'kolish, for God to listen to the voice of man. Ki Hashem nilcham liYisrael. It's not talking about the sun standing still. It's talking about the battle being fought. And that's what the Rabbi continues. It's about the battle. That's why they were able to finish this battle in such a short period of time. Because God can enable them to be victorious. That's a very different way of looking at this story. It's not about the miracle of the sun standing in the middle of the cosmos, but rather it's about Yehoshua on the battlefield saying to God in his tefillah, and again, and you see it in his tefillah, let me finish this battle before the sun sets. And you see it in his charge to the army, where his charge to the army is, don't let them go back to the cities. Yehoshua is fighting the clock. In this case, a calendar. Right? And he's fighting the clock because he doesn't want these armies to escape. And I quoted this verse at the beginning of the, actually it's here. Right before.
Rabbi, did he, I understand it was very close to Shabbat. So
no, that's only
happened
according
in
to that
Shabbat?
Medrash, only according to that Medrash in Beishit Rabbah, which takes the story literally. I don't need to worry about Shabbat in this interpretation.
Oh, okay. So it was not very close to Shabbat. That's
And
the
according
reason
to
it
this,
is.
that's only one opinion in the Bereshit Rabbah who takes the miracle literally. I'm not going in that direction.
Okay. Thank you.
But you can see when he's chasing them, where's that verse? When he says in Pasuk Yutet, V'atem, he says to the army of Israel, Al ta'amodu, don't stand still, don't pause. L'tfu acharei vechem, go and chase your enemies quickly. Al titnum lavo alahem, don't let them go back to their cities. Yehoshua is running against the clock. And so from that perspective, for him to say Shemesh B'Givondom as a reflection of this battle needs to be finished before the sun sets, not because the sun is going to change its course in nature, but the battle needs to speed up. And that's a miracle of a different nature, right? That's a miracle that happens within the context of Yeshua's battle on the battlefield, like David and Melech on the battlefield as well. That's a natural, what I call a natural miracle, not a supernatural one. That essentially is what the Rabbi does. I was known for being the super rationalist in his interpretation of Tanakh. It makes sense, certainly, for the Rabbi. Of the three interpretations, there's a reason why I'm biased to the third, to the Rabbi. And it's not because I have a hard time with the miracles of Tanakh. I don't have any difficulty with the miracles of Tanakh. I don't have any difficulty with the miracles of Kriyas Yamsuf or of Yehoshua bringing the walls down of Yericho and of any of the other great miracles of Tanakh. But my understanding of Sefer Yehoshua and of the sequencing of events in Yehoshua would make this moment in history, were it to have been a miracle greater than any miracle in all of Tanakh, I would have a very hard time in understanding the broader context of the sequence of Sefer Yehoshua. And I'm going to show this to you next week in even greater detail, or in the next chapter. There's a progression in the book. From Yericho, where God says to Yehoshua, I'm sending a malach to take the walls down miraculously, like Kriyas Yamsuf and Kriyat Yarden, from the splitting of the sea to the splitting of the Jordan, and then Yericho, which is a reenactment of Mamad HaSinai and the events of the 7 days of Mamad HaSinai. It starts with that kind of miraculous arm and scope. But slowly, Yehoshua weans off those miracles. The Battle of Ai, the Battle of the North. There's not a single supernatural, miraculous event at all. Yehoshua launches a surprise attack against his enemies. He forces them back into the open cities, into the open fields, and vanquishes them. Those are natural miracles. Those are David Melech style of conquest. To throw into the middle of that sequence, and it's intentional that way, to throw into the middle of that sequence this kind of Shemesh B'Givondom miracle, it doesn't flow in the pshat, in the context of the nature of the book itself. Add to the fact that if there was really if I took it literally, Shemesh B'Givondom, can you imagine any of the Canaanites wanting to fight with Israel after that? Egypt was afraid to fight with Israel after Makat B'Chavot and Kriyat Yamsuf. This would have been a miracle an order of magnitude greater than either of those. And yet the next chapter, the Canaanites are now, the rest of the northern Canaanites are going to fight against Israel. And so from a pshat perspective in the Sefer, it's very hard to sustain the interpretation of the other approaches. The Rabbi makes much more sense in that regard. You'll forgive me for holding on questions. I'm almost finished. I want to make sure we finish within the context of the time. I want to add one piece to this discussion. What the Rabbi doesn't address, and none of the Mefarshim seem to address, but I think is, if I take this approach of the Rabbi, now makes sense. Ask the question why. Why would Yehoshua formulate this miracle of the victory of the battlefield speeding up, so to speak, in language that is so almost kind of disorienting or misleading, is the word I'm looking for, right? Language is almost misleading us to think that it's literal. The answer to that question, I think, is in one phrase. So I've put the text back here. This is Yehoshua Perek. This is the text of Tanakh. Exactly what I showed you in, here, Yehoshua Perek. but now it's here. And I want to think through the analogy, the parallel that we talked about at the beginning. Vayehumem Hashem lifnei Israel. God confounded them. That language is reminiscent of Kriyat Yamsuf, where he confounded the horses or chariots of Paro. And God smote them with a great victory in Givon. Again, to support the Rabbi, the nature of God's role in this is limited in scope in the narrative of the story. God, Yehoshua chases them, and as they're running, how did God smite them? How did God intervene? God brought hail down from the sky. That's how God intervened to assist. Now, in that moment, what does Yehoshua do? The battle's still going on, but Yehoshua can't stop and not acknowledge that moment of that miracle of the hail coming, the barad from the sky, or the confounding of the enemy. Az yitaber Yehoshua laHashem. So what does he do? What does Az yitaber mean? Like Az Yashir? It's Shiva. It's song. It's poetry. Poetry is never meant to be taken literally. Poetry is poetry. Poetry is metaphorical. Poetry is symbolism. Poetry is poetry, right? There's a reason why Neviim Achronim is so much harder to understand than Neviim Rishonim. Poetry is hard, but poetry is powerful. Az yitaber laHashem Yehoshua, laHashem. B'yom tet Hashem et emoni lifnei bnei Yisrael, in the day of his victory. Now, whether he sang that song now, while he's still on the chase, or whether the Navi inserts the song of the victory here in the text, but it was a song he sang afterwards. Unclear. But what is clear is that this text, Shemesh begivon dom, sun, stand still, moon, stay your course until victory is achieved, is not prose. It's shira, it's song. Mm. And that's why I structured it this way. Yehoshua is singing shira, Shemesh begivon dom, Yareach be'emek hayalon, vayidom hashemesh, v'yareach hamad, ad yikom goy oivav. That's the shira. That's the song. The sun stands still. The sun stood still. The moon stayed in Omek Ayalon. The moon stayed in Omek Ayalon until a nation vanquished its enemies. Even the use of third person is part of that shira. This is Yehoshua's song. And Yehoshua's song is very brief. Halohik tubal Sefer Hayashar. That song is written in a book of songs. When is this book of songs? I have no idea. But there's a book called Sefer Hayashar. It's a book of songs, so the book of victories. And in fact, Yehoshua's language was used to describe the victory. They were as if they stood in the middle of the day, but it's as if. Because says the Rabbi. It's a metaphor. They were victorious in their battle in a short period of time, as if the sun stood still for them. This piece is song, shir. Like, for example, I'll give you another example. Bamidbar Parak Aleph. This is in Parshat Chukat. This is after the battle with Moab. Al Ken Yamar b'Sefer Milchamot Hashem. There is written in the book of the wars of God. This is referenced in Sefer Bamidbar. Anybody know what Sefer Milchamot Hashem is? It's a book of the victories of the law of the wars of God. So all the Mepharshim explain this is a book we don't have. But it was a book in which was written the chronicles of all the battles and campaigns that Israel fought on their way into the land of Israel, and the songs they sang is as part of that victory. Because when you are victorious, you sing shira. That's what you do. And what is written there? את והב בסופה ואת נחלים ארנון, ואשד הנחלים אשר נטל לשבט ונשען לגבול מואב. ומשם בארה היא הבאר שאמר השם למשה אסוף את העם ואתנה להם מים. Anybody have a clue what these words mean? I know what the pasuk design means. את והב בסופה ואת הנחלים ארנון ואשת הנחלים אשר נטל לשבט ונשען לגבול מואב. No idea what this means. This is the most esoteric, poetic, unintelligible language of Shira. It's describing the places, it's describing the victory, it's describing, who knows what it's describing? Because we don't have the book, we don't have the context. All we have is this reference. There is a victory, and Sefer Mechamot Hashem is written that we were victorious, and this is the language, the shorthand of what it says there. Nechalim, Arnon, names of rivers, and other rivers, and and places, Moab. We have another shira that's written there. Az Yashir Yisrael at the Shira Azot. Next pasuk, there was another shira that was written there. That shira is the shira known as Shira Be'er. Ali Be'er, Anula, rise up, O well. Answer, Be'er, Chafaru Sarim, Karun, and Diveam, well dug by nobles. B'mechokek b'mishanotam, when their scepters and their laws, midbar matanan, from the midbar to matanan, mimatanat to nachliel, from bamot to bamot. It's unintelligible. The Meforshim go to town trying to figure what this is all about. One thing is clear. It's song. It's poetry. It doesn't have to be literal. We don't know what it is, but it's written in this book that has been lost, Sefer Mechamot Hashem. Not a stretch to assume that that's precisely what Yehoshua is referring to. Az Halohik Tuba al Sefer HaYashar. That might be the same book of Sefer Mechamot Hashem referred to in Bamidbar, and that this whole story is simply about the metaphor Yehoshua used when he sang a song of victory of the moment they were able to vanquish not just 5, but all the other cities of the Canaanites in the south, all the way down to the Sinai, in a handful of days. That victory was equivalent to the literally fighting in such a way that the sun stood still, the nature of that victory and the achievements of Shemesh Begivondo. That's how I see the story. Why that fits into the broader context and the canvas of the sequencing in Sefer Yehoshua, we'll understand better next week, or next 2 weeks as we explore chapter 11. But I wanted you to see this Rabbi again to understand its impact and the suggestion that this entire story about the sun is simply the song of victory in poetry and metaphor that Yehoshua sings to the moment they were able to vanquish all of their enemies in the short time before the sun set. And with that, I will stop sharing and I will take questions. Nope. Somebody has a iPad computer raised hand.
I love what you say, Rabbi Shulman. I love what you say. I have a poem in the Jewish Journal last week where I explain in a poem my explanation for why Joshua stopped the sun. I will send it to you. It's in the Jewish Journal. Anybody can read it. But I think that your explanation is actually better than mine, I'm afraid.
Thank you. I appreciate that. No problem at all.
But
all right.
But please read mine.
As always, wow.
My pleasure. Really my pleasure. And thank you. I apologize if I ran quickly. I just wanted to make sure we finish this in one shir. So I thank you for your patience. And B'ezrat Hashem, next week we will continue with our study of Parakid Aleph, chapter 11.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.